Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughan Manor. And today we're going to be talking about the notorious 1975 novel The Fog by James Herbert. So, The Fog by James Herbert from 1975 was James Herbert's second novel, an English writer, James Herbert. He wrote this book, The Fog, and it's kind of legendary in the horror community for being so extreme. It's extremely violent, so there's extreme violence, and there's lots of sex in it, and there's extreme sex and violence and violent sex, and lots of extreme going on in The Fog by James Herbert. Yeah, it's a little over the top when it comes to that. Very pulpy novel. The Fog by James Herbert, and I decided to read it. I've read actually his first book, The Rats, which was a lot of fun. It's about as fun as you'd expect a horror novel called The Rats to be. I do like this one better, The Fog by James Herbert, his second novel. In this novel, now this is sort of a pulp horror. It's kind of a monster. It's a combination between a monster story and a disaster story. The Fog is a fog. There's an earthquake in a small village, and this fog seeps out of the ground. And whatever the fog covers, any human being or animal that is engulfed in this fog is driven violently insane. And whatever individual is driven violently insane will do terrible, terrible, terrible things. And James Herbert will tell you in graphic detail all the terrible things that are being done. And a lot of terrible things happen in this book. But the fog is kind of a monster in a way. It might even be sentient, maybe. So that is interesting in itself. It seems to follow kind of a pattern that you'll find in old 1950s monster movies, in that there is this monster. So scientists and government people and whoever have to get together and try to figure out how to destroy the monster. And they will eventually come up with some way to destroy the monster. This sort of follows that format. Although it's also kind of a disaster story because a disastrous thing is happening caused by this fog. And this fog, of course, is growing because, you know, that's what great horrific monsters do, is they grow, which is causing more and more problems. So it's flowing over different villages, and eventually, of course, it's going to get to London. So it's kind of a horrific monster, graphically violent disaster story. Is it only that, though? Is it only that? I mean, if it was only that, that would be all right. But is it that and nothing more? I think this is a little bit more than that because, you know, Herbert and Stephen King, they both started roughly at the same time. Herbert started a little earlier than King, by a couple years, I think. And I think Stephen King is the better writer. The writing in The Fog is just okay. Well, it's better than that. But at times it's just okay. At times it's all right. At times it's, you know, it's serviceable. It's good enough to tell the story. Stephen King, I think, is a much better writer. But Stephen King writes in a very different way. And these two, you know, they knew of each other, they respected each other's work, and they influenced each other, I think. But they write in a different way, I think. Stephen King is kind of, you know, he'll just get into his mode, and whatever he thinks of, he'll just throw on the page. And sometimes he doesn't even know what he's going to write until, like, the moment he writes it. This novel, The Fog, had the feel of a book that was well thought out, in that everything that is in it for a reason. Every bit of graphic sex or violence is in there for a reason. There's a reason it's there. And it has it's about something. And the thing that it is about is one of the most tragic aspects of the human condition. The most dangerous thing that humans face in their human world are other humans, unfortunately. It's the human capacity for violence, for one thing. And how even those of us who think that we would never hurt anything or anybody have the capacity to be violent. Any one of us, given the right set of circumstances, could become violent. And James Herbert, despite what you might think from what he writes, is not a big fan of violence in a real world level. In his books, he'll throw it everywhere, deliberately. But that is the tragic condition that we have, as human beings have. Each one of us can become violent given the right set of circumstances. And that is what this book is about. It's how we as a species are our own worst enemy. Not just in our violent actions, but in our inactions and our casual treatment of, say, the environment. The environment is a big part of this book too. Our hero, John Holman, is an agent in the Department of Agriculture. No, Department of the Environment. That's right. And so he is investigating the military and what the military might be doing at a top secret base. And that's at the beginning of this story. And Holman, he is the typical macho, tough guy, super macho, super tough guy, man of action. He seeks out danger. And he's kind of a little bit aloof, but definitely he's a super macho man of action, which you might think would make him kind of a sort of lifeless cardboard cutout. And he could be. There are characters like that in this book, but the interesting thing about Herbert is, one of the interesting things about him is that he'll seldom put up a character like that and just leave them that way. He tends to put something interesting in these characters. And Holman is one of those types of characters because he is a macho, tough guy, man of action, and that is the very thing that is screwing up his life, as he comes to recognize throughout the novel. He realizes this as this disaster unfolds, and he becomes a huge part of it. He was there when this earthquake happened, and he was one of the first victims of the fog. Because he was so close to it, there was some reason that he was able to recover and become immune. And his immunity is important because most other people who become engulfed in the fog, they will all go insane, violently insane. And then they will die eventually, probably, unless they are cured somehow. And the fog is interesting, the way the fog works, because it will drive you crazy, but in the way that it does that is it takes away any of your inhibitions against violent action. So if you really hate somebody, for example, you might just chop them up into little bits with an axe. Whereas, normally you wouldn't do that. But, if you've been dosed by this fog, yeah, you're probably going to do that or something even worse. And so Holman is immune to the fog. And so he is the one that is called upon to go in and do some investigations within the fog and get samples from within the fog itself, which of course puts him in terrible danger. Now he has a girlfriend named Casey, Casey's another character I'll talk about in a minute. There are there are a few characters, but Holman and Casey are probably the only ones that really matter. And Holman, he's totally in love with Casey, but he's not able to commit to her because he's so macho. You know, macho guys, they don't want to commit. You know, that's just a thing, I guess, because otherwise it might make them, I don't know, needy or something. And so he's all fine with sleeping with Casey and occasionally with other people because, you know, he's macho. But because of his experience in the fog, and the trauma that is unleashed from that, he realizes that that is nonsense. And he's like, you know what, if we survive this thing, totally going to commit all the way because I've just been an idiot. And he starts realizing what an idiot he's been. Like when the government is like, you know what, you're the one that's immune to the fog, so you're the one that has to go in the fog, Mr. Man of Action who seeks out danger. And at this point he's like, maybe you can get someone else for that. I'm not sure I want to seek out that much danger. But of course he has to. And, you know, there were other moments with him. Like, there's some, of course, tragic moments. And, you know, he's so macho that even when the worst things happen, he can't cry, for example, at a point where he really, really wants to because he knows that that would give him some relief. And he recognizes that at that point, that the inability to cry, because he's so macho, is a weakness. It's not a strength. And so there are interesting things going on with Holman. So while in the beginning it seems like he would just be a typical action hero, which he is, you know, he's doomed to be that. There's more going on with him because he realizes that's all nonsense. And his girlfriend Casey, you know, she's driven insane at one point because she's covered in the fog. And Casey's sort of a wimpy, wishy-washy daddy's girl, you know. She has an unhealthily close relationship with her father, or at least so Holman thinks. And she does. And she has a hard time getting away from her domineering, smothering dad. But she finally manages to because she's just so in love with Holman. But she's still kind of a wishy-washy, kind of weak-willed character until she gets fogged. And then once she gets fogged and she becomes insane because of the fog, she is just, you don't want to mess with her because she's just very, very, very insanely violent. And she becomes, you know, and it changes her quite a bit, the fog. It reveals an interesting aspect to her character, as it does to everybody who is engulfed in the fog. The first half of this book is very episodic. You know, we'll have something going on with Holman and maybe Casey as the fog is moving around, causing trouble. And then we'll have individual episodes of different people. Excuse any sound in the background. The library is right over the kitchens, and the kitchen staff, they just make terrible noise. I really have to talk to them. Anyway, where was I? Oh, yes. So the fog is running around causing terrible trouble, and we get these individual episodes of different people doing terrible, terrible, terrible things. And there are a few scenes that are just so outrageously over the top, it's almost ridiculous. There are a couple scenes in particular that were so insanely violent that it did seem a little ridiculous at times. There were other interesting moments. We had some, you know, animals attacking people moments because the animals become insane also. But it's interesting the animals that Herbert chose to become insane. Cows, for one, and pigeons. Two animals that are known for their nonviolence towards people. And so it was interesting that he chose those animals to become crazy and vicious and murdering. because it sort of points out what Herbert is trying to say in this book, which is that anybody, no matter how seemingly gentle, could go insanely violent. That was an interesting choice, I thought. It's a little silly. There's a pigeon scene which is just sort of ridiculous in the first part of this book. But when you get to the second part of this book, where the fog has reached London, and Holman has to go in there, into the fog, it becomes this bizarre, almost surreal odyssey of Holman going into the fog and seeing these just nightmarish, horrible things that people are doing in there. And there's a lot of, tons of violence, of course, and a lot of weird stuff going on. There's a lot of violence towards children in this book, which makes sense because children, of course, are the victims of adult violence. They are helpless in this world, just as they are in the real world of violence. And Herbert is pitiless towards these children. And Holman can't do much to help these kids because he's got a specific mission, and there are children all over the city that terrible things that are happening to. And he's, you know, you see his helplessness in this situation, and you kind of feel it too. And it's an interesting thing that Herbert's pointing out there, and how he's being so unflinching about it. Again, just going right towards how we are our own worst enemy as a species, and how capable we are of doing horrible things, with or without the fog. But the fog reveals the depths to which we could go, and occasionally do go, even without the fog. But the writing improves, I think, quite a bit towards the latter half of the book. It's just such a surreal, interesting part of the novel, the second half of this book, which I think elevates the book above the pulp horror level of the earlier parts of the book. So there are some interesting things that happen in the fog. The fog is an interesting thing in itself. The fog, at first, you didn't know, I suppose, whether it was going to be something mysterious, something alien. What is the fog anyway? Well, I'm going to tell you, so if you don't want a spoiler on this, you know, whatever. But it's really, it can only be this thing. The fog is actually something that has been created by human beings. And it has to be that way. So at the beginning, where I was wondering if it was going to be that or something else, it became pretty clear early on that it had to be a monster of our own creation. We created the fog. Just like we're screwing up the environment and doing all this other stuff. Because like he's pounding at you through this whole book, we are our own worst enemy. So much of what happens to us is our own fault. We are to blame for all of our suffering, or at least most of it. And so we created this monster, the fog. Human beings created this monster, which is now destroying us. Yeah, it couldn't be anything else. It had to be that. Following that, there is a typical horror movie conclusion in that a way is found, of course, spoiler alert, to destroy the fog, and it's not great the way that is found. And then you would think it would be over. And Holman at one point is like, I don't know why I thought it would just be over when the fog was gone, because the horror, of course, continues, because the horror always continues for human beings. It's interesting. And there's a point towards the very end where Holman and Casey, who are just battered and beat up and traumatized, and Holman says, you know, we're never going to be the same, basically. We have been changed by what we experienced. And so I think just because of what this book is about, that elevates it above the schlocky pulp the paperback pulp type of book it could just have been. But it really is about something. And I think Herbert does a pretty good job with demonstrating that, in my opinion. I mean, it's pulpy. It's a pulp horror book. But it's a pulp horror book about something that's kind of important, actually. And he does seem to have a lot to say. And like I said, even though some of the characters start off as kind of cardboard cutouts, they don't stay that way. They do change. Holman starts out as a typical man of action and then realizes that's all crap by the end of the book, which I liked. I liked that bit of it. So yeah, The Fog. It's definitely worth reading, but it's so extreme. I didn't even get into the depths of the extremity of the violence and the sex. Let's just say that Herbert goes places where others would fear to tread. And it's sort of it can be over the top and ridiculous, but it works for the story. So there you go. That was my review of The Fog. Hope you liked it. I will catch you on Sunday for my Halloween special, a celebration of Halloween on Sunday. Okay, I will see you then, my friends, here at Stately Vaughan Manor.